Well, let me bring us to order and kick off this session in which we will be introducing our CO2-Secure report and recommendations. I think here, I hope all of us, we certainly feel that Gigaton Scale CO2 removal, CDR, is absolutely necessary for any serious attempt to our net zero and ultimately net negative goals somewhere down the road, a few decades. Certainly the IPCC, the IEA, everyone is on board with the necessity of reaching this gigaton scale in order to maintain, ideally, the 1.5 degrees centigrade. But as I've always said, basically we have to fight for every damn tenth of a degree that we can get, and CDR at scale is certainly going to be a big part of that. We also recognize, obviously, that CDR is not a replacement for mitigation. It's quite the contrary. They have to be complements in order to get there, because some sectors we know we are not going to get to zero in the mitigation pathway. We've got to get close, we hope, and certainly when you talk about the developing world, you talk about our desire for ultimately a net negative emission economy. All of this says we need to focus now and build up to scale in the longer term the gigaton scale CDR, and that's what we're here for. And I have to say that. Unfortunately, I would say the COP27 and its complete, bluntly, failure to address mitigation in a significant way just reinforces the importance of pursuing the CDR agenda. And that's in both the short and the long term. Today, of course, we'll be talking about, in this report, something that's focused on the longer term, following what we hope, and we'll be introducing two of the champions soon, following what we hope is going to be a good, solid decade of building in the pilot and demo phase, for example, to the threshold of really scaling up big time, hopefully with something that looks like, or perhaps looks something like, the kinds of recommendations that we are putting out today. I just say that at the Energy Futures Initiative, I guess I should have said I'm Ernest Moniz from the Energy Futures Initiative. I forgot to mention that. But at EFI, we've been focusing on the CDR agenda now for some time. This is our fifth report, and we've been doing this in concert with a number of colleagues, and I want to especially mention Larry Linden and Roger Ullman, who are here, who have been constants with us. I'm not going to say too much more. I'm going to leave that to Joe Hezir, another principal at EFI, and he will introduce our whole team. But before going there, as I say, I want to introduce two congressmen who have done an enormous amount on the clean energy agenda, and probably had something to do with this room in particular as well, Congressman Tonko there. But Congressman Paul Tonko and Scott Peters are here and are going to say a few words. Congressman Tonko represents the 20th district in New York. I might say that that includes Troy, from where I have an honorary degree, and I'm pleased to be one of your honorary constituents. But they're both advocates of sensible solutions to the major challenges that we see. Again, both great supporters of clean energy technology development as core to climate and economic solutions, and also recognizing the opportunity that Congress has to advance symbiotic policy and for the critical role played by business model innovation and institution building. So Congressman Tonko, as I said, 20th District, serves on the Energy and Commerce Committee, chairs the subcommittee on environment and climate change. Congressman Scott Peters, 52nd District in California, including we just compared notes on the San Diego Padres and the Boston Red Sox, and lamented, actually, I might say. But he's also a member of the House Energy and Commerce Committee. And again, both are really champions of practical solutions to our climate challenges. So I'm going to suggest that they come here sequentially, and of course, following the usual congressional practice of seniority, we will ask Congressman Tonko to come up and say a few words, and then Congressman Peters. Thank you.
Well, Dr. Moniz, thank you for bringing us together, and thank you. I am very much enthusiastic about joining you in the fight for every 1/10 of a degree. That's okay. Okay, good to be with you, though, and I really do thank EFI for all of its work on this report and today's event. And let me also shout out thank you to Rush and Larry for their work, and Danny from the Bipartisan Policy Center, and Savita from ClearPath, all of whom are making good things happen. And I see Brendan Larkin in the back of the room from my team. Brendan has worked with so many of you, and he's masterful in the work that he's done, and was very much involved on our behalf with the legislation that moved us forward this year. So very proud of that, and certainly want to cite my colleague and friend, Scott Peters, from that California delegation. Scott cares deeply, is deeply invested in decarbonization, and I appreciate the effort, Scott, that you're making with me on partnering up on this carbon removal legislation. It's wonderful to be part of this event with so many experts and analysts thinking about an issue that has not really received the attention that it needs or deserves from Congress. Since joining Congress in 2009, I've seen firsthand what can happen when the federal government invests in clean energy innovation. We have seen revolutions in batteries and solar and wind, and certainly several other technologies because of the federal government's support for entrepreneurs and innovators. And now we need that same commitment for the next generation of technologies: direct air capture, clean hydrogen, and offshore wind. These are the solutions that are going to help get us over that finish line to a net zero economy. And because they are new, emerging industries, federal investment can ensure that we get them right from the start by requiring projects be developed responsibly with robust community engagement and, of course, strong labor and environmental standards. That is the benefit of having the public sector partner with businesses, with NGOs, and academics on these cutting-edge industries. For carbon removal in particular, I believe the climate science community has been clear that even under the best-case scenario, we will need these technologies, as Dr. Moniz indicated. But if we do not start to develop what we will need for that last 10% of decarbonization today, they will not be ready when we really need them to be at scale in the 2030s and 40s. Many different removal technologies are very promising, but they are also new and expensive. They need to scale massively, and they need customers that are willing to pay for this service. Private commitments are starting to happen, but in the end, carbon removal will need federal policy intervention to scale to where it needs to be. And I think that's appropriate. Carbon removal can be thought of as a public service that is providing a societal benefit, enabling us to hit our climate goals, which are indeed robust. But it isn't obvious who, other than the government, will pay for it at the scale necessary. So I'm very excited that DOE is moving forward with developing DAC hubs with funding from the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law. And building upon that investment, Congressman Scott Peters and I have introduced legislation that puts forward a vision for a longer-term federal role in strengthening demand for carbon removal projects through procurement. The bill requires DOE to pay for the removal of a specific number of tons each year. Over time, the number of tons goes up, and the maximum price DOE can pay goes down as a way to continue to drive cost reductions. This would guarantee demand that can help jumpstart the industry and provide long-term certainty at significant scale. And I believe this may be a viable near or medium-term approach. But to get to where we need to ultimately go, we need to think big and bigger. And that is where Secretary Moniz and his team are great at doing. trying to identify what the needs will be and what role for certain the government should play. These are not easy questions, and the answers could require billions of dollars of annual expenditures. So getting the structure and governance of a long-term carbon renewable procurement program right is indeed critically important. Very grateful that this report can help jumpstart that conversation. And as we move into the 118th Congress, I want to continue to explore these questions to build upon the success of the bipartisan infrastructure law and try to figure out what is that right model for the federal government to support emerging carbon removal industries in a way that allows us to hit our long-term climate goals. So thank you again to EFI for this report and for organizing this briefing. It should be an excellent discussion and certainly critical in formulating our approach as we go down the road of success to build upon this year's great move forward. So thank you, Dr. Moniz. Thank you all participants, and great to be with you.
Good morning. It's wonderful to be with you. I think the Red Sox and the Padres don't always agree on everything, but the fact that Mookie Betts is a Dodger is really a bad development. So let's talk about something even more challenging than that, though. And thanks to Secretary Moniz and Chairman Tonko. It's a pleasure to join you today to talk about the future of carbon removal. Thanks to EFI for your leadership and work on the CO2-Secure report. You've been conducting cutting-edge research on a variety of important energy topics that we really listen to, and we're grateful for your leadership and your partnership. So for carbon removal, 2022 was a pretty good year. In April, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change stated that carbon removal will be essential to reach net zero greenhouse gas emissions. But we know, though, that for carbon removal to play this essential role, we have to scale it exponentially. We need to remove 5 to 10 billion tons of carbon dioxide per year by 2050. That's 1 million times more tons annually than we remove today. To reach this scale, we have to rapidly drive down the cost of carbon removal to at least, or at most, $100 per ton of carbon removed. So we have a lot of work to do, and I believe it can be done. And our progress over the last year has helped shape my optimism. In government, as Paul mentioned, Congress has passed the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act that included $3.6 billion for direct air capture hubs, and the Inflation Reduction Act, which raised the tax credit for permanent carbon removal from $50 to $180 per ton. Under President Biden, the Department of Energy launched its carbon negative shot, the U.S. government's first major innovation effort in carbon dioxide removal. These policies and initiatives are already helping to drive new investments and new projects. And the private sector is leading as well. This year, Stripe, Alphabet, Shopify, Meta, and McKinsey launched an advanced market commitment worth nearly $1 billion for carbon removal. So to keep the momentum going, I look forward to working with Chairman Tonko and our colleagues on 3 priorities for the coming year. First, facilitating effective implementation. Second, advancing pragmatic policy wins. And third, building more political support for government procurement of carbon removal. First, implementation. Carbon removal has quiet bipartisan support that continues to grow every year. The last thing we want is a high-profile failure. We need to support sound implementation of the investments Congress already passed, and whether we were under Democrats or Republicans, oversight of the implementation of these bills will be a really important part of the 118th Congress mission. Second, policy wins. Energy policy will be bipartisan in the 118th Congress. This past year, Representatives Susan Wild, Tom Malinowski, and I led a letter with nearly 20 House colleagues supporting robust funding across existing federal carbon removal programs in the annual budget bill. Our advocacy led to a $71 million increase in research, development, and demonstration funding for carbon removal solutions in the House funding bill. Next year's letter should be bipartisan, and we'll need your help to make that happen. Another opportunity will be the Farm Bill. We should collaborate to make sure that science-based forest management, reforestation, and soil carbon storage are included because we need nature-based solutions and engineered carbon removal solutions. Earlier this year, as Chairman Tonko mentioned, we introduced the Federal Carbon Dioxide Removal Leadership Act. That bill would create a sustainable long-term market for direct air capture and other technology-based carbon removal solutions. I applaud Chairman Tonko and his very talented staff putting that legislation together and honored to be a co-lead on it. While a federal carbon removal procurement bill is unlikely to pass in the short term, we should be building our coalition now so that we're ready when the political window of opportunity opens. And that requires, third, political support. We have to lay the groundwork now for the ambitious policies we will need in the future, and we'll need your help to continue to build the bipartisan consensus for carbon removal procurement and for improving our existing bills. EFI's new report details the path forward. The authors make the case that large-scale carbon dioxide removal is a public good that merits large-scale public investment. They propose a new national carbon removal authority to secure carbon dioxide removal through several different methods. It's a must-read for policymakers, and I'm excited to use it to guide my future efforts in collaboration with Chairman Tonko and our colleagues. Thank you again for the invitation. I'm really excited about working on this area of innovation. It's something that I talked to Secretary Moniz about a few years ago in a little round table talking about drinks, about what was next. It's not early anymore. Now it's on time, and I'm looking forward to big progress this year. Again, thanks for all your work, and look forward to our talks in the 118.
Good morning, everyone, and thank you for coming here today. I'm Joe Hezir. I'm a principal at Energy Futures Initiative. I've had the good fortune of working with former Secretary Moniz now for over a decade and in 3 different capacities. And so today, I'm here to present an outline of our report on CO2-Secure. But first, I want to just thank our team and identify all the people who've made major contributions to this effort. First of all, Tim Steeves and Sam Savitz were the 2 principal leads on this and did all the yeoman's work on the research and the writing for this document. And you'll hear more from both of them in when we get to the panel discussion. Also want to recognize Rick Westerdale, who did a great deal of work in developing the costing model that we used in pricing out the program. And then finally, Nola Shelton, who did the final copy edit and preparation of the report. And finally, our comms team, Alicia Moulton, Sonia Velasquez, Georgia Lyon, and J.C. Scallion, who did all of the preparation work for this event today. So with that, let me go on and let's go to the first slide, Tim. There we go. So this first slide illustrates why CDR is an essential element of any comprehensive strategy to address climate change. And it merely illustrates the points that Secretary Moniz made and Congressman Tonko and Peters have made in their remarks this morning. So I won't go into it in much more detail other than to point out that not getting to net zero is going to be a significant challenge. And getting to that level is going to require negative emissions, but getting beyond that to some level of climate stabilization will require net negative emissions of significant scale. And the IPCC, which has been leading the scientific and analytical work on this issue, has estimated that most recently that number globally for carbon removal is going to be between 3 and 8 billion tons a year, or as we affectionately refer to it as gigatons, by 2050. This is a global number, but and there's no really set number for the U.S., but to put this into context, the U.S., looking at it historically, the U.S. has contributed cumulatively about 25% of the atmospheric CO2 that currently exists. So when we think about domestic policy for CDR, we also need to be thinking about gigaton scale. Next slide. So the interest in CDR has been relatively recent, but it has been growing very rapidly. believe it or not, that really the first comprehensive assessment of CDR was conducted by the National Academy of Sciences in 2019, which is only 3 years ago. And then since that time, EFI began its work. And as Secretary Moniz indicated, this is now our 5th report in a series on this topic. We're pleased to note here that congressional response has been very swift and very significant, beginning with targeted funding to DOE for setting up a CDR R&D program and various tax incentives to encourage voluntary investment in deployment. I think the key new element, and I think the Congressman addressed this, was the establishment of a direct air capture hub program in the infrastructure bill. And that program will result in the establishment of 4 what we call DAC hubs here in the coming years. And so we think that these programs combined are really going to be very important in driving innovation in the CDR space. And we also think that they will be very important in fostering voluntary private sector investments, such as the Frontier Fund that Congressman Peters referred to earlier. And so while we can't really forecast what level of CDR deployment is going to come from all of these programs, it will no doubt reach the megaton scale, we think, by the end of this decade. But when you compare that to the first slide, you see that we are still an order of magnitude below where we need to be by mid-century in order to achieve our climate policy objectives. Next slide. So that then leads us to the concept of CO2-Secure, which we think is really the next step. And it really and in our report, we're outlining a sort of a longer-term vision for how to scale CDR to a gigaton level. And it really is based on this fundamental principle that climate remediation, acting through carbon removal, is a public good. And as a public good, it requires federal investment in terms of procuring CDR services directly, and it would build on and add to the various incentives that are currently in place, including the voluntary private sector as activities. This slide really outlines sort of the underlying rationale, and let me just go through a couple of these points here. First, we need to recognize that climate remediation provides a public good benefit, not unlike other environmental or natural resources benefits. The technical term that economists use when they refer to public goods are things like non-appropriable and non-excludable. And I'm not going to go into detail on that terminology, but we do discuss these concepts in our report as laying out the foundation for the initiative. Secondly, we wanted to point out that the cost for climate remediation cannot be readily allocable to emitters because we're dealing here with CO2 emissions that have occurred over centuries by a number of entities, and many that are no longer exist or that could not easily be apportioned. And then third, we believe that the voluntary incentives, as I said earlier, while very significant, will not reach the gigaton scale alone with the predictable magnitude and the timing that we really need to address the impacts of adverse climate change. So finally, the faster that we move on the carbon removal trajectory, the lower the cost will be in the future of the adverse climate change. So going to the next slide, we've already referred to the Federal Carbon Leadership Act that Congressman Tonko and Peters have co-sponsored. There also was another bill that was introduced called the CREST Act, both of whom create pilot programs for carbon dioxide procurement. The Federal Carbon Removal Leadership Act establishes a larger scale demonstration program over a longer period of time, 10 years. And it also provides a lot of flexibility in terms of the acquisition methods. Both of these bills would assign responsibility for the program to DOE, and both bills would authorize annual appropriations to implement them. We view both of these proposals as important precursors and would provide the demonstration needed to put us on a path leading toward eventually gigaton scale removal. We also note here at the bottom that in several states, most notably New York State, are considering similar proposals. So going to the next slide, this is a kind of a very, very brief and very high-level summary of the concept and the framework that we are proposing for the CO2-Secure initiative. The first is obviously to articulate a very clear programmatic goal, namely for the U.S. to reach gigaton scale carbon removal by mid-century. Secondly, a recognition that this program represents a longer-term vision for scaling up from current experience that we hope to gain not only from the innovation programs, but also from the DAC hub demonstrations and from the initial demonstrations on purchasing that we hope will be enacted in the Federal Carbon Dioxide Leadership Act. So we envision that CO2-Secure would not get underway immediately, but really, and not really in this decade, but would rather be a follow-on program to what the experience that we hope to gain in the current decade. A key element in our proposal, and we've discussed this at some length in our report, is that ultimately to operate at this scale, that we're going to need to establish a new governmental entity. We undertook a very detailed review of various analog models for government entities that could operate in this scale and this magnitude. And our recommendation in our report is that there's a need for a mission-focused government corporation that would be the appropriate model. The reason for this is several reasons. One is that a government corporation would have a governing board that could bring diverse expertise to bear and provide strong strategic direction to this type of a program. It also would provide flexible authorities that could invest in a wide variety of CDR pathways. And it could utilize a variety of very flexible business arrangements, particularly the public-private partnerships. And then last but not least, a corporation, a government corporation, could operate and manage large-scale program with many individual transactions. On this latter point, just to put that into perspective, consider that under the current law, the DOE is currently tasked to implement these 4 DAC hubs. Each of these hubs initially are going to be on the order of 1 megaton or 1 million tons per year. And so to get from there to a gigaton, one needs to think of 1,000 DAC hubs. And when you start thinking about the magnitude of the transactions and the management challenges associated with that, it definitely calls for an entity that has much different characteristics than you would find currently in DOE. That's not being critical of DOE, just saying that as a federal agency, it has its limitations. So the other thing about in our proposal is that we think that managing the storage of this level of CO2 will require very close attention to what we call MRV, monitoring, reporting, and verification, as well as measures to address the potential liability from any CO2 that might be subject to leakage, particularly at this scale. And so in our proposed framework, as we discuss in the report, we are assuming a very robust MRV framework would be set up by this new entity, and that this also would include a plan to establish an insurance-like fund to address any potential liability issues. And that finally, executing these multi-year contracts for procuring CDR services on a large scale will require a great deal of financial certainty on both sides of the transaction. And our framework includes a recommendation for multi-year direct spending authority, but subject to audit and to congressional oversight. And in the modeling work that we did in our report, we estimate that in the first 10 years of the ramp up of CO2-Secure, the estimated total cost would be about $33 billion. And I think, finally, I think we have a handout that all of you have on your chairs today that has a little more detail about these major features. So going to the next slide, this slide sort of attempts to show visually the comparison in both scale and in terms of time frame of how the proposed CO2-Secure initiative would interface relative to current programs and also to the current legislative proposals. The notation at the top there on the Frontier AMC is the private sector fund that Representative Peters referred to. The DAC hubs is the infrastructure law bill, and the two bars down at the bottom are our estimates of what could be achieved under either of the two current pending legislative proposals. But as you can see, we're looking for much further out and much bigger scale. That's the point of that picture. So going on to the next slide, I want to illustrate one further element of our proposal, which is the types of projects that would be undertaken and supported under CO2-Secure. As I think Representative Tonko pointed out earlier, the field of carbon removal is currently in a stage of rapid innovation. And while direct air capture, or DAC, is currently the form of CO2 that receives the most attention, there are multiple pathways to CDR, and there are a variety of methods within each of these pathways. Our framework for CO2-Secure does not attempt to specify a preferred CDR method, nor does it restrict any CDR option. Instead, in our framework, in our report, we've outlined the sort of a performance-based eligibility criteria that could be open to all CDR pathways and all CDR methods. And so the key performance requirements that we discuss in our report are listed here on the right side of this slide, with emphasis on really on the first two: verifiable removals and additional actions over and above what can be supported under other federal programs. On the left-hand side of the chart, we have this little matrix here showing scale and certainty in removal. And as you can see on the upper right-hand corner, you can see that today, direct air capture and bioenergy with carbon capture and storage, or BECCS, are probably, when combined with geologic storage, are probably the leading methods that can achieve both scale and permanence. But we don't want to limit CO2-Secure just to those two options. We think that over the course of the decade, many of the approaches that are in the other boxes will also be moving forward into that right-hand box. And as I said, if they can meet the performance requirements, then I think they should be eligible as well for support under the CDR initiative. So next slide. So this is sort of our conclusion. So in conclusion, our report attempts to lay out sort of this longer-term vision for CDR deployment as an essential element of climate policy. We discuss in detail the rationale behind the concept that we talked about today, the sort of the public good aspect of it, and the need for direct investment in acquisition of CDR services. We also provide much more detail on the proposed architecture for the program, including the organizational structure, the authorities, the various business models that could be implemented, how the liability protection would work, and also how the cost and schedule estimates were developed. So our goal here today in this report is really to try and put some meat on the bones behind this concept and to sort of make the case, to begin to lay out the case for why we need this longer-term vision and why we need to begin to go down this pathway of looking at federal investment and federal acquisition of CDR services as an important element in climate policy. So we hope this will help stimulate further discussion And so we look forward to, follow-up interaction with all of you today. So thanks again for coming, and thanks for your participation. And so with that, I'm going to turn it over to Sam Savitz, my colleague, who will sort of lead the next round of discussion, talking about with the panel. Thank you.
Okay, thanks everyone for coming out, and thank you, Joe, for the introduction. As Joe said, I'm Sam Savitz. I'm a senior research associate at EFI and one of the authors of this report. I'm thrilled today to be hosting a panel discussion with some wonderful CDR policy experts to get some different perspectives on the carbon procurement concept and the policy work that's been done in this area. We're going to have a moderated panel discussion for a couple minutes, followed by questions from the audience, both in the room and online. So be thinking about what questions you want to ask to the panel. But I'll start by introducing them. So Savita Bowman is a program manager for carbon management at ClearPath, a DC-based nonprofit working to develop and advance policies to accelerate innovations that reduce emissions. ClearPath works on technologies such as nuclear carbon capture, geothermal, heavy industry decarbonization, and CDR. Prior to joining ClearPath, Savvy managed solar and storage assets at Tesla and also consulted for PRODI and the UN Development Program. Danny Broberg is a senior policy analyst for the Bipartisan Policy Center's energy program, where he leverages a decade of experience on next-generation clean energy technologies and carbon removal policies. Prior to joining BBC, he worked on energy policy as a legislative fellow in the office of Senator Chris Coons, also a sponsor of one of the bills we talked about, where he assisted with the Bipartisan Senate Climate Solutions Caucus and supported legislation on carbon capture, clean energy commercialization, and leveraging energy efficiency to address the economic collapse from the pandemic. And then Tim Steeves is my colleague at EFI. He's the project lead for the CO2-Secure project and a senior research associate at EFI, where he works on the research team to develop and communicate solutions to challenges in clean energy development, climate change, and the points of intersection with labor, environmental justice, and international development. He was most recently a senior policy fellow at the carbon removal-focused nonprofit Carbon 180, where he worked on recommendations related to federal regulations, including the Class 6 well program. So thank you all for being here today. We'll jump right in with the questions. So one thing that's been talked about a lot is the frontier, advanced market commitment. The carbon procurement idea has been discussed at some points as a way to sort of stand up a private market. But on the other hand, a key premise of our report is that the need for a federal policy that values carbon removal as a public good, sort of, and a long-term federal responsibility. So we'll go down the line, each of you. How do you see the roles and relationship of these voluntary private markets and the federal government in this area? And how might that evolve as if the government starts investing in CDR at larger scales? Savvy, starting with you.
Thank you so much. Can everybody hear me okay?
Hello.
Hello? Oh, okay. Thank you so much. Sorry about that. Hi, everyone. Thank you all for having me here today. It's great to be with all of you and talk more about carbon removal. So as was mentioned multiple times today, actually, companies all around are devising climate strategies and pouring billions of dollars of private sector investment into CDR, as you've noted. But those investments alone are not enough to meet our Gigaton goals. Policy solutions focused on diverse technological innovations and market-based incentives are needed to supply the surging demand that's happening right now. The relationship between VCMs and the federal government will need to work together to get the solution off the ground. Mechanisms for the government to support early efforts to lower the cost of a new technology have been frequently used in the past. A recent example was the federal government's advanced market commitment to COVID-19 vaccines. And then a famous example in the energy sector in the 70s was for solar panels. So it's clear that this is a solution that has worked. But both of these examples helped create an initial market for a product that would not have developed otherwise. And so with that basis, the federal government's involvement in scaling up this technology is a powerful signal to the market to send the idea out there that there is a buyer ready if the suppliers can meet that. So a federal competitive purchase program like the ones outlined today, the Bipartisan Carbon Removal and Emissions Storage Technologies Act, or CREST Act for short, increases buying power, sends that clear signal to the market, and levels the playing field for various types of carbon removal solutions to compete, not just direct air capture, because we are getting innovative. We're not just talking about big machines anymore. We have natural solutions which have been around forever, and we have hybrid solutions that are coming into the fold. So I'll leave it there.
Well, thanks for having me, and congratulations on the report, EFI team. It's really a great accomplishment. So I guess I would start with saying, why are we here today? We're talking about procurement. The US government is the largest buyer of goods and services in the world, and traditionally what they buy is sort of directly used by the government. And so that's concrete, construction workers, services for building things. And what we're talking about today is the government buying carbon removal, which is an entirely new concept and is going to take some iteration, I think. I think what this report has gotten right is talking about the scale, the magnitude of the challenge here. IPCC has made it clear that we need to get to Gigaton Scale by mid-century, and that's going to take a lot. Joe did a great job sort of walking through how we're, the ambition right now in the medium term is sort of megaton scale, millions of tons with the DAC hubs and other bipartisan programs. But getting to billions of tons is going to take a lot of thinking. On the question about voluntary carbon markets, again, it's about scale. Voluntary carbon markets are a way for channeling private sector funds towards these carbon removal solutions. And the overlap with procurement policy, I would say, I guess I would say the voluntary carbon market has had a few examples of it stumbling, specifically around sort of MRV challenges, as Joe spelled that out earlier. And these questions about accounting, additionality, how to do carbon removal projects right, are not unique to the voluntary carbon markets. They're also going to apply to anything we talk about for procurement. I applaud the EFI team for setting up the vision for sort of talking about this in the 2030 timeframe. I think there's a lot that can be said about what's going to happen in the next decade. There's a lot of great things that Congress has done. Thank you to the two congressmen from earlier. They're leaders in this field, and there's much more we can do in the 10 years ahead of us.
Yeah, I'll keep it pretty short. I thought those were great answers in general. I would say, when I talk about our motivation for this, it really comes down to when you think about just the massive scale of an industry that you're trying to build out. So, DAC hubs are going to be these huge investments, and then you're talking about building 1,000 of them all across the country in different areas with different levels of opportunity, new types of technology. All of this requires people, I think, acting in good faith and with certainty on both sides. And so I think the government can step in and play a really, really important role as the buyer of this market that I think Frontier, AMC, these advanced market commitments are doing a really good job at the megaton level, but I don't think it makes sense for them to do it, at the sheer scale to accommodate the overall legacy emissions of the entire country since, 1700s, for example. But I'll throw it back to Sam.
Yeah, thanks for all those answers. I want to touch on something, Danny and Savvy, that you both mentioned in your answer, which is the bipartisanship of this issue. And it was also brought up in the remarks from the representatives. So all of our organizations are really interested in creating coalitions around these technologies. Things like the DAC hubs have passed with bipartisan support. So with a divided Congress taking its seats in January, how would each of you make the case that direct federal investment of this kind merits bipartisan support?
So bipartisan cooperation is going to be essential to advance any meaningful policy in the next Congress. Even in the current Congress, most of the major energy legislation that was enacted was either enacted on a bipartisan basis or contained provisions which enjoyed bipartisan support historically. Fortunately, technology innovation has always been a bipartisan space, so I'm optimistic that carbon removal will enjoy the same support. And also because the CREST Act is a bipartisan and also bicameral bill that has been now introduced in Congress. That is a signal in the next Congress that there is a path forward for implementing something like this in the longer term. Yes, it is a pilot program, but it's working out those kinks, talking about the MRV, understanding, does this work, does this not work, and then going from there and building up thoughtfully, because we are going to be spending a lot of money on all of these solutions. They're not cheap solutions, they're very new. So making sure that we are looking into all of these different details as we scale up is going to be very critical. And then maintaining bipartisanship can also be accomplished by collaborating on areas that have common interests on the path forward. So areas that will sort of enjoy that bipartisan support include implementation on permitting, scaling tech while supporting early stage R&D. So on the implementation piece, I know we've got the bipartisan infrastructure package, and we've got DAC hubs, we've got CDR carbon negative shot at DOE. All of these different programs are great, but we need to make sure that the implementation of them are successful in order to maintain that CDR is actually a great solution and needs to be advanced forward. And then on the permitting infrastructure piece, I think something that I will highlight, there are a lot of permitting challenges, but something that I will highlight is on the carbon storage front, which was mentioned earlier. There's only two states, with primacy in the US today for Class 6 wells. And if we're going to be storing gigatons of CO2 underground, we're gonna need more than 2 states with primacy to be able to do that. And I think furthermore, I kind of touched on it and Danny touched on this, is the MRV component. I think talking about MRV seems like an amorphous kind of topic that everyone is trying to wrap their heads around, but comparing it against solutions, DAC MRV is gonna look very different than ocean carbon removal MRV. How do we make that comparable? How do we make sure that they're detailed enough and they get the right questions answered, but they don't deviate far enough from the main goal, which is being able to compare 1 ton of carbon across the board? And I think ensuring that these pieces are sort of met through bipartisan policies is going to be critical in the next Congress.
Great, thanks. And Danny, BPC has bipartisan in the name, so your take on this?
No, I completely agree with everything Savvy just laid out. I think the CRUST Act definitely demonstrates that this can be done on a bipartisan basis. And moreover, I would offer that Congress has almost already authorized and appropriated some procurement efforts in the past 2 years. The DAC commercial prize is a $1 per ton payment specifically for direct air capture, but that was $100 million authorized by the Energy Act of 2020 and then funded by the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law. And it's structured like a procurement program. It's albeit through a sort of prize competition authority. But that's a very concrete example of Congress has already, has done this before and we can do it again. What we're talking about here is obviously broadening to all forms of carbon removal and taking into account durability and important factors. So we can do this again.
Great, thanks. And Tim, do you want to weigh in on this one? Or?
I'll just say I'll add my other perspective, which is just going back to what Ernie said at the beginning, which is fighting for every damn 0.1 degrees centigrade, is pointing out that we're already paying the cost of this, and so I think it's really exciting to hear things moving forward now, because the faster we move on this, the better shape we'll be in 20 or 30 years, and we won't be. We might still be throwing $30 billion at disaster relief every December when we are making the budgets, but we maybe will not have to triple or quadruple that.
Thanks for that answer, Tim. So I think because we're short on time, we'll switch now to questions from the audience. So my colleagues from the EFI communications team will have a microphone for people here who might want to ask a question. Please just state your name and your affiliation before you do that. And for questions from the online audience too, you can put those in the chat and they'll be sent up here to me. So anyone? Yes, we have a question over here. And feel free to ask questions on any part of the presentation. Joe's going to come up as well to answer questions on the slides if you have questions there as well.
All right. Thank you very much for that great presentation. My name is Spencer Schecht. I'm with the Global Carbon Capture and Storage Institute. I think a lot of folks would say, this sounds great. When you say, how about in your backyard? They say, whoa, whoa, whoa. And so I'm going to say 2 words that might haunt this project, which is pipelines and permanence, and that people would be very, very reserved about both of those elements. And I'm curious, obviously, these sorts of funding opportunities and this federal investment can't speak to all those things directly, but I'm curious if the panelists can talk more about that, because that's going to be the other side of this, which is winning people over. You could talk economics and technology, but in terms of getting people on board for these things, that is a whole other element.
I'll take that one and just give you two quick, you raise a very good point, and I think it is a significant challenge. We do talk about it in our report. I would just make 2 points that I think in dealing with carbon dioxide removal, unlike point source carbon capture, we have much more flexibility in siting. So you can, in some cases, particularly with DAC, you can locate it concurrently with the storage and minimize the infrastructure needs. And so I think that piece is very, very important. And I think also that the variety of CDR methods, if we're talking about soil management, nature-based solutions, coastal blue CDR, and even deep ocean water CDR, there's opportunities there where the infrastructure needs, or the infrastructure, they all need infrastructure, but the challenges there, particularly the permitting and the siting, are a lot less. So I think, no question there'll be challenges, but I think that we think that it can be manageable.
Danny, did you have a statement on
Yeah,
that?
well, I mean, I would completely agree with everything you just said, but I think it's a good point. I think there's going to be a tremendous education campaign that needs to happen, not just for the concept of CDR procurement, but just for CDR in general. And that's going to be done on a technology by technology basis, on a project by project basis. I mean, some of us have joked before, hearing what's a DAC. That's like not an unreasonable question. This is, a decade ago, this was sort of science fiction, and now it's becoming real, and it's quickly becoming more and more real. And I think education's a huge part of this, for sure.
Savvy, did you have something you want to add here?
Sorry, I was just trying to get the mic back on. There are examples of companies doing this well, historically, engaging with communities and educating them before they go out and just deploy the technology. One company, which I'll highlight today, but is not the only company, Carbon Capture Inc., they have held multiple town halls with the areas that they're going to be deploying in Wyoming to kind of get a better understanding of what is the community looking for, how to educate the community on what this is, and make sure that there is a relationship built before just going in there with a solution. And I think continuing that effort and continuing the education piece is going to be critical as we move forward.
I'll add one last note on that, which is in the report we talk about public ownership of infrastructure too. So communities that can actually make the decision themselves to own this infrastructure and benefit their community financially from it is an option that procurement opens up as well. So we've got a question here from the chat that's been sent in to me on innovation. So it comes from Irene, and she's asking the role of government procurement is clear, but what's the role of government to support moving earlier stage CDR pathways into more certain degrees of permanence, for example, by facilitating piloting testing of new methodologies and MRV?
Yeah, I mean, I think this gets at a really good point, which is that we need to be advancing all stages of the innovation pipeline simultaneously. There's going to be early stage research that continues to be done. There's going to be deployment efforts, pilot efforts, and there's going to be commercial scale efforts that all need to happen. They're all going to require public sector support in varying degrees. In terms of how procurement can support earlier stage aspects, I think there's an interesting question about what procurement looks like in the next 5 to 10 years when the carbon removal projects effectively are pilot projects. So are we procuring from pilots? That kind of gives a new meaning to sort of pilot procurement. It's something that will continue to be explored, I think. It's a good question.
Right. Let me just jump in here and add that clearly a lot of these areas, including the MRV techniques, will need further research and development. And the thing that I want to point out is the increase in congressional appropriations for CDR R&D over the past couple years. And we're hopeful that in the next few weeks that Congress will be able to agree on an omnibus for FY 2023, because in looking at what the House and the Senate have already done, hopefully we can get appropriations in a level of about 175 million or so in DOE in the coming fiscal year for CDR research.
Yeah, I'd say also that a procurement program provides signal. Savvy mentioned the vaccine procurement that provided a stable market to encourage innovators, in that case, to develop these technologies. And as we said, with these MRV and additionality criteria, someone getting the payment from this program would need to establish that they've set up sufficient MRV around that. The other option, Danny brought up the DAC prize competition, which is sort of the version of this that we've already passed. It has a pre-commercial prize program paired with it that sort of carves out a portion of funding for emerging technologies, and we talk in the reports about the possibility of doing something similar for this program as well.
And I would just say in the CREST Act, there's actually provisions that expand R&D to be more robust. At DOE, there is research that's being done in the lab scale for CDR, but it's not as broad as it could be, and it's not as technology inclusive as it could be. And having those additional pieces for carbon mineralization, biomass carbon removal solutions, ocean carbon removal solutions, gives us a chance to take many bites at the apple instead of just trying one solution and putting all of our eggs in one basket. And I think having that support at a robust level at the R&D scale for DOE to kind of implement and tackle is also going to be relevant to the procurement piece. So,
Yeah, definitely. Thanks. I think we have time for one more question from here in the room. Over here on the end.
Cheers, thanks. Hi, I'm Rudra Kapila from Third Way. Thank you for your presentation. And given these policy proposals at the federal level, I was curious if it spurred any action at the state level, given that's going to be paramount for actual deployment of these technologies. Thanks.
So New York State has a procurement proposal on the table that was mentioned earlier in the talk, which actually has a lot of similarities in terms of structure with the CREST Act. And so I think the state level policy is critical because it's a learning curve of understanding what works, what's going to be effective when it's deployed, and what perhaps needs some revision. So states are going to be critical as we move forward with this, but I believe California as well has a couple of proposals that they're looking into. And so state level action is definitely needed.
Yeah, I'll add another thing. Something we didn't get to go into too much in this presentation is we talk a little bit about regionality and flexibility, about what sort of projects might be needed across the entire country. So if you look at carbon storage, for example, we have lots of carbon storage available in places where we've traditionally done oil and gas extraction, but also plenty of carbon storage where we haven't, and so that infrastructure is not nearly as built up. In that way, when we think about this sort of state involvement and state actors, states coming in and saying they want something here, they want to build something out here, we want them to be empowered to basically have this flexible partnerships so that, up in Washington State, they can start building out a carbon storage infrastructure and partner with other states. So it's essentially, I think states need to be partners in this. We have a hugely diverse country geographically, and we have a lot of opportunities to do different types of carbon dioxide removal, all sorts of different methodologies and techniques. So.
Yeah, I'll just add on to Savvy's point about what's been introduced already, that Massachusetts, Representative Massachusetts State House also announced during COP27 that they were going to be bringing up a version of this CDR Leadership Act as well. And there's actually a program at the sub-state level, at the local level, something called the Four Corners Coalition, which started with a program in Boulder, Colorado, I believe. So looking at this at all levels of government, which I think is fascinating, there's a real opportunity for a laboratories of democracy thing here, where these state and local government programs can provide lessons to the federal government and vice versa in implementing a program like this. So with that, I think we're out of time for questions, but I will turn it back over to our esteemed CEO to close us out here. Thank you. Thank you to all the panelists for participating today.
Thanks to all of you. Wish we had more time. And also want to welcome back Congressman Tonko, who had a little bit of a voting issue he had to take care of. But we'll leave that to you to explain. Very good. I'm just going to make a few comments because we are over time. One is I think it's worth noting what I think we all implicitly acknowledge, that the nature of the conversation around CDR has fundamentally changed. We see that momentum building in so many dimensions, and it wasn't that long ago that there were many voices, saying things like, "Oh, this is just a way for fossil fuel companies or something to do more." We're past that. That this is now viewed widely as a core part of the place we have to go in addressing climate change. That's a big deal. And in fact, it's one reason why it's not too early to be talking now about some of the big steps we got to take a decade and 15 years from now at scale, because there is the momentum to get this program rolling. Congressman Tonko and his friends, we're counting on you for that, starting in 2023 or maybe 2022 actually. So anyway, so I think that's a very, very big deal. Secondly, we obviously understand that the recommendations that Joe outlined in the report for that big scale we're talking about is not exactly for the faint of heart, but neither is the challenge. And so that's why, it's good that we have a decade to help shape more precisely this big scaling that we will need in the next decade. In terms of the scale, it's worth saying, I think it was in Joe's slides, that the order of 5 gigatons a year globally by mid-century is kind of the ballpark we're talking about. 5 gigatons a year of crude oil is the size of that industry, just to get a kind of a benchmark. And so if one was talking about, let's say, DAC, just for scale, that's what we're talking about in terms of how much fluid we will be needing to manage. It's a big deal. But it also invokes another issue that we have not mentioned. And I would argue that, and again, I'm using DAC as a reference point, even though a broader portfolio is something we all want. But the skill sets needed, the communities needed to execute that program, I think are part of the bipartisan appeal. Fossil fuel communities, for example, have lots of workers who have the skill sets to manage this, and there are positive social equity implications of getting this program done, which I think is something maybe we need to think about doing more with. And finally, I just mention my now favorite phrase written about 2 weeks ago by Lord Brown of Mattingly as he was sitting at COP27 was, quotes, "Pragmatism executed at speed is better than perfection delivered too late." And I think that's the mantra that we need to have in getting this critical program going. So again, thanks to all of you. We look forward to working together on this the next year, the next decade, some of you at least for the next few decades, and getting to our net zero, our net negative future. So thank you very much.